Welcome to the Hindu Daily.
We have a really packed deep dive today, right? 9 distinct articles to get through.
Yeah, exactly. Categorized right out of the newspaper's layout. And we're diving straight into the first source from the editorial section, which is just this massive, high-stakes debate over the rules of democratic representation.
Right, the delimitation issue.
Yeah, we are talking about redrawing the electoral map, which is, it's essentially like changing the scoring rules of a game right before the whistle blows.
That's a really good way to put it. So the focus of this debate is the special session of Parliament. Specifically, they're looking at the implementation of the Nari Shakti Vandana Adhiniyam.
That's the 2023 Women's Reservation Act, right?
Exactly. And the timeline for when this actually takes effect has become, well, a major point of friction.
And just a quick pause here, just to be crystal clear with you, the listener, before we get into the weeds. We are absolutely not taking any political sides here.
No, not at all.
Our goal is strictly to unpack the arguments as they're being presented by both the government and the opposition regarding these constitutional mechanics.
Right, we're just looking at the mechanics. So the Act introduced Article 334A into the Constitution. Originally, that article mandated that the 1/3 reservation for women in the Lok Sabha and Vidhan Sabhas would only happen after the next census.
And a subsequent delimitation process. Right?
Yes. But the opposition had pushed for immediate implementation. So now the government plans to amend Article 334A to make the reservation applicable from 2029 itself.
Instead of waiting for that post-census delimitation.
Exactly.
I mean, that timeline shift is huge.
Right.
Especially when you look at the historical contrast. Like, think back to the 73rd and 74th Constitution amendments back in 1993.
Under Rajiv Gandhi, yeah.
Right. Those amendments brought reservations to panchayats and nagarpalikas. And they required almost 5 years of intense, methodical discussion across the whole political spectrum.
It was a very long process.
But the result of that patient process is that we now have about 15 lakh elected women in local bodies. But this current shift, it's happening in a tearing hurry. They're bypassing requests for all-party meetings and standard consultative processes.
Well, and the rush points to a larger underlying structural issue, which is the delayed census.
Oh, right.
The 2021 decadal census was postponed, so we are now looking at a digital 2027 census.
Wait, a digital one?
Yeah, and because it's digital, officials expect the enumeration numbers to be available that very same year. But the argument being raised by critics is that this rushed special session is actually a tactic to delay and derail the promised caste census.
Interesting, because states like Bihar and Telangana have already shown that a comprehensive caste census can be done in just 6 months, right?
Exactly. So the national delay feels very intentional to a lot of observers.
Which brings us back to the real anxiety hiding underneath all of this. Delimitation.
Yeah, that's the big one.
Like, how does this impending redrawing of electoral boundaries impact smaller states? Or, say, states that have successfully pioneered family planning? If I am a state that actively worked to lower my birth rate, do I get penalized by losing my voice in Parliament?
And that right there is the core friction point over equitable representation. Because if delimitation is executed purely arithmetically, just based on current populations, then states that aggressively control their population growth, which are predominantly the southern states, they stand to lose relative influence in the Lok Sabha.
Because their populations grew slower than the northern states.
Right. So the difference in absolute numbers gets magnified on the electoral map. It could potentially shift the balance of national power away from the very states that followed the government's demographic guidelines.
Wow. Okay, so from political incumbents changing the rules to preserve power, we shift over to our second piece in the editorial section. This is about economic incumbents changing their strategies to preserve wealth.
This is a fascinating trend.
It really is. We are seeing this incredible pivot among India's business elite. Second and third generation families are just, well, they're cashing out of active industries.
VIP Industries is the prime example here.
Right, a major player in branded luggage. It's a healthy, profitable company, yet it's being positioned for sale so the heirs can take the capital and just run passive family offices.
Yeah, and we can understand this pivot through Peter Turchin's theory. It's called elite overproduction.
Elite overproduction. What does that mean exactly?
Well, Turchin argues that when a society produces more credentialed elites than there are influential positions for them, it usually causes political instability. But in India's corporate sphere, it's manifesting as this massive risk retreat among the wealthy.
They're choosing wealth custodianship over business creation.
Exactly. You can also look at it through Oswald Spengler's historical cycle. He describes societies moving from culture to civilization.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning, we transition from being the visionary builders of foundational institutions, the culture phase, to the administrators who merely extract value from what already exists, the civilization phase.
Okay, but I have to push back on the premise here for a second.
Sure.
Wait, isn't liquidating a single business and diversifying those assets into real estate or bonds or international markets, isn't that just smart, rational portfolio management for an individual? Like, if I inherit a luggage company, maybe I just don't want to make suitcases.
Oh, absolutely. It is entirely rational for the individual. Protecting wealth through diversification is a very logical personal strategy.
Right.
The tragedy lies at the macroeconomic level. When the specific individuals who control the vast majority of private capital and institutional access collectively opt out of nation building, the entire economy stagnates.
Ah, I see.
Consider the dramatic drop in research and development spending in India right now, especially compared to aggressive innovators like China or South Korea.
Because R&D requires patient capital. I mean, it might take a decade to yield results, and it carries a huge reputational risk if the research just leads to a dead end.
And for a second-generation heir, taking that kind of risk is no longer a tool to build wealth. It's a direct threat to the wealth they have already secured.
That makes total sense.
Contrast that posture with first-generation founders. When Dhirubhai Ambani built the Patalganga refinery, he took massive, irreversible risks. Failure would have been total, public, and financially devastating.
Right. He put it all on the line.
But today's inherited elite are utilizing passive family offices to permanently shield themselves from that kind of transformational economy-driving risk.
Wow. Okay, so while the top 1% choose passive wealth management, let's look at the grassroots, because rural workers are actively adopting new technologies to scale up physical production.
Yes, moving to the opinion section now.
Right. We are talking about harnessing the blue revolution. India is now the second largest fish and aquaculture producer globally,
hitting 197.75 lakh tons in 2024-25.
which is massive. But the wild part to me is that 75% of that output comes from inland sources, not the ocean.
Yeah, inland reservoir fisheries have become a massive economic engine for rural India. The 2026-27 budget heavily targets 500 reservoirs and community ponds.
The Amrit Sarovars, right?
Yes, to enhance fish farmers' incomes. And the leap in raw productivity is staggering. Back in 2006, these inland bodies were yielding about 50 kilograms of fish per hectare.
Okay.
Today, it's 100 kilograms, and the target is 300 kilograms per hectare.
That scale is just mind-boggling, especially when you realize Tamil Nadu alone has over 8,000 reservoirs.
It's a huge opportunity.
But how does this actually work on the ground? Like, how does this new cluster-based strategy by the National Fisheries Development Board change the daily life of a single fish farmer?
Well, the mechanism driving this is called cage culture technology. So instead of just releasing fish into a massive lake and, trying to catch them later.
Which sounds incredibly inefficient.
Very. Instead, farmers use floating or stationary mesh cages. The mesh allows the natural reservoir water to flow through, which maintains oxygen levels and cleanliness. But it keeps the fish contained for highly efficient feeding and monitoring.
Ah, okay. And the cluster strategy?
It aggregates local farmers into cooperatives to manage these cages. Take the story of Bimal Chandra Oran at the Chandal Reservoir in Jharkhand.
What's his setup like?
He operates just 2 cages, and by receiving subsidized seed, feed, and marketing support through his local cooperative, he cultures tilapia and pangasius. He is now achieving an annual turnover of over 3 lakh rupees.
Oh, wow. So the cooperative model turns what used to be a highly fragmented, unpredictable struggle into a streamlined, profitable supply chain.
Exactly.
So in fisheries, we manipulate the water environment to boost yields. But moving over to today's science section, scientists have just discovered how bacteria manipulate the human skin environment to boost infections.
This is a groundbreaking biological discovery.
It really is. A study from UT Southwestern shows exactly why men suffer more skin infections than women. And it's not just about hygiene. It's because the skin itself secretes sex hormones.
Like testosterone.
Yeah.
The biological mechanics here are incredible. The skin's sebaceous glands make testosterone readily available right on the surface.
Yeah.
And Staphylococcus aureus bacteria,
The ones that cause common skin infections, right?
right, they have evolved to essentially eavesdrop on those hormones. They use the ambient testosterone as a signal to activate a process called quorum sensing.
Wait, quorum sensing, like a bacterial quorum.
Yes. It's basically a communication system bacteria use to coordinate their behavior. They wait until their population is dense enough, and then the testosterone acts as a chemical trigger. It tells the entire bacterial colony to launch their attack simultaneously.
That is terrifyingly smart. But the treatment strategy the researchers developed is brilliant. They use a mirror image hormone and an enantiomer called ANT.
Right, because it's structurally reversed.
Exactly. So when it binds to the bacteria's receptors, it blocks the communication pathway. It essentially jams the signal. Dr. Sindhura John uses this amazing analogy in the source. She says, it's like calming down an angry person instead of killing them.
That's a perfect way to describe it.
But I have to ask, why is keeping these bacteria alive but quote-unquote calm better for our microbiome?
Because conventional antibiotics operate on a scorched earth policy. They just try to kill all the bacteria.
Right.
But that creates massive evolutionary pressure. The few bacteria that naturally survive the antibiotic, they mutate and multiply. And that leads to the global crisis of antimicrobial resistance, or superbugs.
Oh, I see.
So by deploying NT to merely disrupt their quorum sensing, you stop the organized infection without threatening the individual bacteria's survival.
They stay alive, but completely disorganized.
Exactly. And this preserves the beneficial microbes on your skin and entirely sidesteps that selective pressure that causes drug resistance.
That is a fundamental shift in how we approach infectious disease. Science is learning to move away from the binary of kill or be killed, and they're finding these nuanced middle grounds.
Yes, absolutely.
Tragically, though, as we look at the first article in the text and context section, we see that our trial courts are trapped in exactly that kind of deadly binary.
Yeah, the rigid legal architecture forces trial judges into impossible life or death decisions.
We're talking about the Satanculum custodial death case. A Madurai judge recently sentenced 9 policemen to death. But Judge G. Muthukumaran essentially wrote a confession into his final order. He stated he felt legally forced to choose the gallows.
It highlights a really profound structural flaw. Under current law, trial courts have exactly 2 options for capital crimes: standard life imprisonment or the death penalty.
Just those 2.
Just those 2. The problem is that a standard life sentence requires the state to consider parole after 14 years. So Judge Muthukumaran looked at the extreme brutality of these police custody deaths and felt that allowing these men back on the street in 14 years was just drastically too lenient.
Right, so let me see if I had this straight. We basically have a broken ladder where the bottom rung is forced to be extreme, but the top rung fixes it later. Why not just give the trial judge the middle option? Like life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Because of a 2015 Supreme Court ruling, this rehiring case, it explicitly banned trial courts from issuing life without remission sentences.
Wait, really? Why?
The Supreme Court ruled that only constitutional courts, meaning the high courts and the Supreme Court, are allowed to invent that special category of a fixed-term life sentence, like 30 years without parole.
But why deny that to the trial courts?
Defenders of this system fear that if local sessions judges have this power, they might impose wildly inconsistent sentences based on local prejudices. They believe appellate scrutiny is the only safeguard.
Okay, but what's actually happening on the ground?
Well, data from the Square Circle Clinic shows a grim reality. The mitigation guidelines meant to prevent arbitrary death sentences at the trial level are just routinely ignored anyway.
Wow.
So appellate courts constantly use fixed-term sentences to bridge the gap. Yet they preemptively deny that exact middle ground tool to the trial judges, the very people who are staring the perpetrators in the face and actually evaluating the raw evidence.
That is incredibly frustrating. So the legal system struggles with rigid binaries that ignore practical realities on the ground.
Completely.
And we see a very similar practical struggle in our second text and context article, this time focusing on rural policy. The transition to clean energy has hit a massive cost barrier.
Yes. The modern biomass revolution.
Right. People are literally going back to burning firewood because commercial LPG gas prices have skyrocketed over 100 rupees per kilo. But weight isn't going, quote-unquote, backwards to firewood going to cause mass deforestation. How is this a step forward in sustainability?
Well, it sounds like a regression because we automatically associate firewood with traditional mud chulas.
Yeah, exactly.
But those old stoves run at barely 10% thermal efficiency, meaning 90% of the energy is lost. It causes terrible indoor smoke pollution and requires massive amounts of wood.
So what's the new solution?
Improved cook stoves, or ICS. They use secondary aeration technology. They funnel oxygen back into the burn chamber to catch and incinerate soot and harmful gases before they can escape as toxic smoke.
Oh, wow.
This boosts thermal efficiency up to 38 to 45%. Because the stoves extract so much more heat from the same piece of wood, families need drastically less timber to cook a meal, and that prevents mass deforestation.
And the economics of that efficiency are undeniable. I mean, 4 kilos of firewood, which costs about 10 rupees a kilo, gives you the exact same cooking energy as 1 kilo of LPG.
Right.
That is a daily cost saving of over 60% for a rural household.
And furthermore, these modern cook stoves do not even have to rely on raw timber. They can run on alternative biomass, like dense pellets made from compressed sawdust or agricultural waste.
Which takes the pressure off the forests entirely.
Exactly. And while the upfront cost of buying one of these high-tech stoves can be a barrier, they are increasingly being subsidized by carbon credits.
Oh, that's clever.
Yeah, the emissions saved by moving a family from a smoky mud chula to a clean ICS are tracked, verified, and turned into a funding stream that pays for the hardware.
So Firewood is about the struggle for affordable access to physical resources. Now let's look at the escalating war over affordable access to digital resources.
The shadow library war.
Yes, our final article in the text and context section. In early 2026, the domains for Anna's archive, which is one of the largest shadow libraries in the world, they were taken down.
But shadow libraries, including sites like Z Library and Sci-Hub, they still host tens of millions of pirated books and academic papers.
And the core ethical conflict surrounding these sites has existed for years, right? Users in developing nations rely heavily on these shadow libraries to bypass unequitable paywalls for education.
Exactly. The traditional narrative has always been everyday readers and students fighting against wealthy, restrictive publishers.
But there's a massive plot twist changing the landscape now. AI companies are allegedly scraping these shadow libraries to train their massive language models for free.
Yes, there's an ongoing lawsuit where authors allege NVIDIA used sources like Anna's archive to ingest copyrighted works for AI training.
So this creates a huge moral dilemma. If publishers are seen as the bad guys for locking knowledge behind paywalls, aren't AI companies also the bad guys for taking that community-liberated knowledge to build trillion-dollar commercial products?
That specific dilemma is fracturing the open access movement. People who happily supported piracy to help a medical student in India get a textbook, they are deeply uncomfortable with a global tech giant using that same pirate site to extract massive commercial value.
Without compensating the original authors, of course.
Right. Sridhar Gautam, a convener for Open Access India, he points out that shadow libraries are just a symptom of a fundamentally broken publishing system.
So what's his alternative?
He advocates for something called Diamond Open Access. This is a public sector-led model in India where neither the readers nor the authors pay any fees.
How does that work?
It relies on publicly funded research organizations to host and distribute the knowledge legally. It essentially cuts out both the predatory publishers and the pirate middlemen.
That debate just perfectly shows how global tech forces can exploit localized digital goods.
Absolutely.
And as we move into the spotlight section of the paper, we see how global trade forces are exploiting a legal loophole to devastate a localized physical Indian industry.
The South Indian matchbox industry.
Right, centered around Sivakasi, facing an existential threat. And this industry provides about 5 lakh jobs.
The history there is incredibly rich. In 1922, 2 cousins, A. Shinmuga Nadar and P. Aya Nadar, they traveled to Calcutta to learn the art of match manufacturing.
Spurred by Gandhi's Swadeshi movement, right?
Yes, which promoted Indian self-reliance. They opened their first manufacturing unit in Sivakasi in 1923, utilizing local wood and local labor to break the region's reliance on foreign imports.
And they survived so much over the last century. They survived the transition to residential gas stoves. They modernized to stay afloat, managing to raise the retail price to just 1 rupee for a box of 30 sticks.
But now they're facing a fatal threat: cheap Chinese plastic lighters.
And the math is brutal here. A plastic lighter costs 10 rupees, but it yields roughly 250 strikes.
Which is the equivalent of 10 matchboxes.
Exactly, making direct competition mathematically impossible.
And the real tragedy is that this is happening because well-intentioned regulations are failing entirely due to simple bureaucratic loopholes.
Because the Union government actually tried to stop this, right?
They did. They recognized the threat and issued an order restricting the import of lighters that cost less than 20 rupees apiece. The intention was to price the cheap plastics out of the market.
But the traders just found a loophole. They started importing the fully assembled lighters under the customs category of spare parts.
Yes.
I mean, that's like importing a whole car tax-free just by shipping the steering wheel in a separate box.
The evasion is blatant. and the stakes are incredibly high. Beyond those 5 lakh jobs, these single-use plastic lighters are terrible for the environment.
Right, they end up in landfills or oceans.
Which is why they are already banned in ecologically sensitive areas like the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Furthermore, the business model for these cheap lighters relies heavily on tax evasion from the point of import all the way to the retail sale.
Meanwhile, the eco-friendly homegrown match industry faithfully pays its 5% GST.
Exactly. So the match manufacturers are pleading for a total blanket ban on the physical possession and sale of these cheap lighters, just hoping to save their industry from being wiped out by a paperwork technicality.
So the match industry is paralyzed by a bureaucratic loophole. But if we look at our final spotlight article covering India's tech capital, we see another total paralysis, and this time it's literal gridlock on the streets.
Bengaluru's road widening crisis.
Yeah, 15 years of deadlock driven by a flawed land compensation tool. The ground reality is brutal, taking 20 minutes to travel just 3 kilometers on the ITPL main road due to vehicle growth.
It's gone from roughly 21 lakh vehicles in 2006 to 1.2 crore in 2026.
Insane.
The city planners did see this coming, though. The revised master plan of 2015, which was drafted back in 2007, proposed widening these crucial bottlenecks to 150 feet.
But it's totally stalled.
Because of the core conflict. The civic bodies simply do not have the massive liquid funds required to buy the land under the 2013 Land Act.
Right, so what's their workaround?
The government wants to acquire the land using transferable development rights, or TDR.
Okay, so TDR basically means that instead of paying cash for the strip of land they are taking for the road, the government gives the landowner a certificate.
Exactly.
And that certificate allows for extra building floor area, which the landowner can theoretically sell to a private developer somewhere else.
That's the idea.
But if I own land, why would I accept an IOU voucher that I have to hawk to random builders instead of just getting paid the market rate for my property?
Well, you wouldn't, and that lack of participation is the city's catch-22. The public has zero trust in the TDR system.
Why is the trust so low?
First, there is no structured marketplace to sell these certificates. You have to rely on intermediaries. Second, the market was previously flooded with fake certificates from a massive scam, making genuine developers terrified of buying them.
Oh, that's a mess.
And to make matters worse, the government recently introduced a premium FR scheme.
FAR meaning floor area ratio.
Yes. Under premium FR, builders can just buy extra floor area directly from the government by paying a fee. This actively undercuts the value of the TDR certificates the landowners are trying to sell.
Because why buy from a landowner when you can just pay the government directly?
Exactly. It renders the TDR vouchers effectively worthless.
So the government has no cash to buy the land, and the public won't accept the vouchers because the government actively devalued them. Total standstill.
Total standstill.
Meanwhile, you have urban activists like the late writer U.R. and Anthemurthy arguing that widening roads is like making a new hole in a belt instead of losing weight.
It's a great analogy. It just induces more private traffic.
Right. Well, it perfectly encapsulates the deadlock of modern urban development. Without a trusted mechanism for financial compensation and without a radical shift toward mass transit, the city just remains choked by its own growth.
The tools designed to fix the problem are just too broken to deploy.
Thank you for listening. If you want to provide suggestions, please contact on the Twitter handle given in the episode description. As always, we are eager to hear what our listeners want to be informed about. We wish you a great day.